Welcome to PR Done and Dunner. I'm Bob Geller, and I'm really pleased to welcome our next guest. He's a top legal analyst and media commentator. He's featured regularly in print and top broadcast publications and outlets. Too many really to mention. A list as long as my arm, but I'll mention a few: CBS, CNBC, USA Today, Fortune, VentureBeat, etc. Which, as a PR guy, I got to tell you, I find really impressive. His name is Aron Solomon. We're having him on today to discuss the legal limits of hype. Welcome, Aron, and great to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Bob. It's great to be here. We're recording on the day of the big Elon Musk news as well.
So that's right.
It's interesting times. I've spent most of today on doing TV hits for the Elon Musk thing. Yeah.
Wow. So you've been talking about that, huh?
Yes, a lot.
In some ways, it's surprising. In other ways, maybe not so surprising.
I think it ties in perfectly to what we're talking about today about the kind of limits of hype. Because if you're Elon Musk, there are none.
Exactly. He sets the limits. He's gotten in trouble, by the way. He's gotten spanked, I know, by SEC for some.
As he will again.
No question about that. But before we get into it, it'd be great to give the audience a little bit of context. You are not just a commentator. You have a day job or maybe multiple ones. Can you explain a little bit about your other roles?
Absolutely. So I'm the chief legal analyst at a company called Esquire Digital. Esquire Digital is based out of Philadelphia, and we're a full service legal marketing agency. So really what we do is we use everything from, video to all the other tools that legal marketers have available to help lawyers grow their businesses. And we have clients all over the nation. So with Esquire Digital, I, as you mentioned, get on TV and radio and into a lot of publications, writing stuff on behalf of myself and helping our clients in those ways. And really just trying to create a dialogue where the law intersects with other things, with society and politics and sports and life and all the things that I'm sure we're going to touch on today, because I don't think you can have a legal practice in 2022 without being connected to all of these things. I think it really is kind of intimately involved in all these areas.
I'd imagine it's maybe a challenge to juggle those multiple roles.
It can be. I mean, it depends. The legal commenting part of what I do, I think is really natural. I'm someone who loves to keep a close eye on what the Supreme Court and state courts are doing, what legislatures are doing. I think I'm naturally inclined to follow politics. I'm also lucky because I've lived all over the world. I've traveled over 3,000 miles. I've lived in places like Stockholm and Shanghai and Beijing. I just came back from living, when the pandemic began, from living in 4 years in Berlin.
Wow.
So I think I kind of come at things with an international perspective as well.
Yeah, I wanted to, the reason for this episode is I think by now everybody has heard about the Theranos episode and the verdict against Elizabeth Holmes, which sent shockwaves, especially through the tech world and the tech startup world. But before we get into that, I thought I might look at another area that's been in the news that I think a lot of people closely associate with hype or exaggeration, and that is false advertising. And I'm talking about burgers, more specifically Burger King. You're aware of that case that's in the news now?
Yeah, I am. This came up a couple of weeks ago. So, it's very interesting, right? So we all know this. Like, you see an advertisement for a fast food restaurant. It looks good. I mean, no matter, kind of what it's funny because I mentioned Berlin a couple of minutes ago. Berlin is a huge vegan city with a really significant vegan population.
You wouldn't expect that in Germany.
No, it is. Yeah, so
it's bean potatoes there.
I know it's one of two ways. Either you're eating like
reversed.
Exactly, like lots of meat, or you're a vegan. But all of these like vegan things that you see, especially over there, you see pictures of them, they look really good. And then you see them in person and they're kind of like this generic gray. Well, I bring that up because it's the same thing with burgers. I mean, we all probably have memories of eating fast food when we were a kid. I'm old enough to remember living in the United States when I was a kid. I remember the old McDonald's filet of fish. I remember it used to be big. It's not big anymore, obviously. It's tiny. It's a couple of bites. So the problem is that the Federal Trade Commission has regulations about false advertising. The FTC governs what brands can and can't say. Burger King got into trouble recently for exactly what I just mentioned, which is the reality of their burgers don't match how their burgers look in advertising, and that's false advertising.
Yeah, but I mean, as you said, pretty much everyone does it, right? It's interesting to me because I read into this story and it looks like, I mean, it wasn't an action by the FTC, but some lawyer, actually, some individual, it looks like, brought this as a civil suit. Is that correct?
Exactly. They brought it as a civil suit, but of course, the FTC that helps regulate false advertising, they work with the Department of Justice, with a bunch of different folks to make sure that the things, that are said in ads follow the legally set forth guidelines. But yeah, this is like an actual plaintiff saying the burger that I was served doesn't match the burger that I saw a picture of, which is kind of a comical lawsuit. It makes us think back to that old Seinfeld episode with the lawyer Jackie Treehorn and Kramer when he got burned with hot coffee. And he's like, wasn't expecting the coffee to be hot. I don't know. But I mean, we see this with every fast food place. The reality is the pictures that we see of the food it can't match. You can't match the reality of a Burger King Whopper with the images you're going to get when professional food stylists and photographers work with it.
All right, let's be clear, or maybe, I don't know if you have any insight to this, but you're a lawyer as well. And is this possibly a good PR stunt by a lawyer?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely possibly it. So this is a good PR stunt for a lawyer who actually may represent clients in product liability claims. I think that's a good idea. The other thing, though, is if you think about these companies like Burger King, is there any bad press? Meaning that, look, like you said, we all know that the reality of a Whopper served in a restaurant or a drive-through is different from the pictures. So if this lawsuit is actually causing people to talk about Burger King more than they're talking about McDonald's, or if the words Burger King up come in more fast food related sentences than they normally would, well, that's got to be a net gain for Burger King.
Absolutely, but they told a Whopper. Sorry,
that's even better, because Whopper being a lie, but Whopper also being their sandwich. I mean, I don't know. I don't think it's a terrible thing for Burger King. Like you said, everybody does it. I've never seen a fast food picture, especially when you're hungry, that doesn't look good. And it's funny because, I live in the city and go on long walks with my dog, and I walk by a McDonald's sometimes. And you see the golden arches, right? And you get this like image in your mind of what it's going to be like. You get this sense. But every single time I walk by McDonald's, I guess I just smell like not the freshest oil in the world. And like once you're near the McDonald's, it's not very appealing. That's just the reality. And that's what advertising does, right? Advertising is all about telling us that things are a certain way when we actually know they're not.
But how often really, first of all, was the FTC involved at all in this action, or did the lawyer just cite the guidelines from the FTC? Or
the lawyer cited the guidelines for the FTC, but the FTC is involved when companies, whether they're fast food restaurants or whatever, say things that are not false. I mean, lawyers can't say things that are false either. There's bar associations across the country that have very strict rules on what lawyers are allowed and not allowed to say about their practice. So, I mean, I think that the problem is that when it comes to advertising, and I love this movie, Art and Copy. It's a Doug Cray movie, and it talks about how many advertising messages a day we receive. And I think they quoted something like 5,000 advertising messages a day. So there's two problems with that. Number one, not everybody is going to be as equally adept at processing or understanding those messages as everybody else. And the second thing is we often don't know that some of these messages are advertising messages.
Good point. This reminds me of a book going way back many years called Subliminal Seduction, about subliminal.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
That was a classic. All right, let's get a little closer to home in the topic at hand. And I'm just curious. I mean, clearly we've all heard about false advertising, but do the same laws govern false PR claims or IR claims?
It's a lot tougher, right? So the easiest thing for the FTC and related bodies to deal with is when you're making a false advertising of something that's like super, super provable, like a product. So if you want to think in technology terms, for example, of a Whopper as hardware, it's very easy to show that the hardware that you're advertising isn't matching what you're actually getting. It's like if you saw pictures for iPhones, and then you went to an Apple store and you're like, this iPhone isn't anywhere near as nice as the picture I just saw. Of course, with iPhones, they are. It's a real picture of the real device. Right. So I mean, it's the easiest when it comes to like a physical thing. But when it comes to claims, yeah, I mean, the FTC is responsible for dealing with false and potentially injurious claims as well. Claims of what a product can do. We remember in the old days, all those snake oil salesmen, right?
Sure.
If you take this tonic, you will be, I don't know, better in bed, you'll have more hair, you'll have whatever the case is. And there are regulations about that. You can't do it.
Right. I'm just trying to differentiate between paid advertising and earned media, for example. And if there's really a difference there in the claims that someone may make in a press release versus what you make in a paid advertisement. Does the FTC treat those the same?
The FTC is generally looking at, traditional advertising. So looking at paid advertising, they've got a whole area of focus on internet ads because it's so easy to fool people on the internet. It's so easy to make things look like they're not. I think a false PR claim is one thing. I think me coming on this show or going on NBC as I'm on regularly and saying a false thing is treated differently.
Makes sense. Well, we started by talking about Theranos and the verdict against Elizabeth Holmes. I was nowhere near there. I'm innocent, but our PR firm does focus on the tech sector. We work with a lot of startups. Some say that PR aids and abets hype. Now with that verdict, everything is suddenly more real. You've heard of hate crimes. As we go forward and do PR and others in marketing, do their marketing and advertising, it's a logical question. Are we committing a hype crime?
That's I love that, Mac. There's nothing that I can say that's as good as what you just said there. I think that we commit hype crimes every day. The problem with hype is, and as we keep committing these hype crimes over and over and over again, this is the best thing you've ever seen. This is the best burger you've ever eaten. When everything is best, when everything is number one, it just desensitizes us to all reality. Not everything we eat, not every technology we use, not every software we're a part of is going to be the best. That's not the way that life works. So I think that we're all committing these hype crimes. I think that there's a cumulative effect to them as well.
Makes sense. But specifically Theranos and Holmes, what do you think of the verdict? What do you think of that whole?
So I followed it very, very closely, even before the trial, but I followed the entire Elizabeth Holmes trial and commented on it almost daily on NBC News. I'm also following the Sunny Balwani part of the trial just as closely. I was actually on NBC last night about this. And I think that, what's interesting is Elizabeth Holmes was convicted of counts of wire fraud against her investors. So really what the jury said was, the biggest crime that you committed was against your investors. I think that's a bunch of garbage because the investors in Theranos were very savvy people. These were some of the top investors in the world, very powerful people also like Henry Kissinger and George Shultz. And these are, pardon my language, grown-ass men who can take care of themselves. There wasn't enough of a focus on what Theranos did to the patients, to the actual end users of their products, and how any deception that Theranos did could have cost lives. The focus really was on this interstate commerce, wire fraud thing. And I think that really isn't how history should write the story. I think that if you've got a negative view of Theranos, history should be writing the story that what Elizabeth Holmes was doing was putting people's lives at stake.
True. So do you think she should have had some consequences from that, some legal consequences?
I think she should have had legal consequences, but I really don't think the verdict was a great verdict. I think Sunny Balwani is going to come up with kind of a similar kind of verdict. His jury will as well. Because like I said, I don't have really any sympathy for the investors. I think that the prosecutors kind of overreached in their charges, but even if they didn't hit a home run with Elizabeth Holmes, they got a good triple, getting those guilty counts that they did. And as I say, to me, it doesn't really resonate that, the whole point of venture capital, this working with, a PR firm in the tech sector, is that these venture capital firms know that they're going to lose the vast majority of their investments. Right. You've got to have that one investment that hits 20x or 100x or 1000x to make up for all the other investments that you have that just aren't going to work out. So the idea that, this college dropout who started Theranos at 19 years old was able to sucker in all of these guys, these basically old white men, because she was so charming, and that we should feel bad that they lost their money. It just doesn't resonate with me.
Maybe where we disagree in that I do think that there's a difference between outright lying and exaggeration. And
Agreed.
I think that, she crossed a line somewhere. Some folks wanted to give her a pass and attribute it to sexism. And the fact that let's cut these female CEO founders a break. I'm not sure I buy the fact that these rich VCs weren't harmed. I mean, maybe there's some shared liability there. Okay, shame on them, but shame on her too for misleading people.
Right.
And it's like a bad movie where everybody comes out looking pretty bad. But,
I'm with you on that. It is very much like a bad movie, and a bad movie that then bred really bad streaming services made for TV stuff.
I was amused because Ellen Pao, are you familiar with that name? She was a ex-Kleiner Perkins.
Oh yeah, she was the one who did the lawsuit.
She did the lawsuit against Kleiner. She wrote an op-ed supporting Elizabeth Holmes, talking about sexism in tech. And then Maureen Dowd, another great journalist and columnist for the Times, who I respect, wrote an opinion piece saying, basically sexism, this ain't sisters, and calling Ellen Pao to task about her cutting a break to Elizabeth Holmes. But back to the Sunny Balwani trial. So do you feel like that's getting less attention than the Elizabeth Holmes trial?
Well, it's getting less attention for sure, because Elizabeth Holmes was an international superstar. I mean, you could say she was a super villain, but the image of her in the Steve Jobs turtleneck holding the little vial of blood Sunny Balwani is not that. The Sunny Balwani trial, I mean, he was basically an investor and the chief operating officer of Theranos. What the defense counsel, his counsel, is trying to do is show that, oh no, Elizabeth Holmes was running the whole shop. He was in a relationship with Elizabeth Holmes. He was many years her senior, much more experienced. He was an investor. He was calling the operation shots. And even if Elizabeth Holmes was ultimately the one responsible for saying yes or no to key decisions, Sunny Balwani was the ops guy. And everybody who knows startups knows that the ops people make decisions. And he's not going to be successful. His counsel won't be successful in arguing to a jury that, no, that wasn't the case.
It is basically the same charges, isn't it? And pretty much almost the same, very similar case.
Yes, and the reason they separated them, they usually try them together, was at Sunny Balwani's request, because he knew that Elizabeth Holmes basically was saying, that he coerced me sexually, emotionally, all these different ways. So he didn't want to be, having to defend himself against a prosecutor and Elizabeth Holmes in the same trial.
Interesting. But what about the implications then of the Holmes verdict? And who knows what will happen with Sunny? Maybe he'll get some charges to stick as well. Does it set a new standard that puts the cuffs on the fake it till you make it Valley and startup ethos, do you think?
So that's a great question. Fake it until you make it isn't going to disappear. It can't disappear. And fake it till you make it, by the way, isn't the fault of founders. It's the fault of investors. I've been in so many investor meetings on both sides of the table as an entrepreneur and as someone who's been like a venture partner for venture funds, where I've seen people who don't want to be faking it get put in the position where they have to fake it because, VCs are pressing for hard numbers where they can't possibly exist. So the game itself is a cycle that's going to go on forever. Entrepreneurs aren't going to stop faking it, but there's a delineation now between, faking it and lying. So for example, Elizabeth Holmes saying, look, our technology is going to be able to do all these things that a regular blood test does, just with one drop of blood. But we're not quite there yet, but we feel confident that our technology is going to reach that level. There's a very different thing from Elizabeth Holmes saying, we have military contracts where those contracts didn't exist. Yeah. So the fake it till you make it part's not going away, because if you don't fake it, you can't make it. But we have military contracts, or our technology does all these things, like this Edison black box that Theranos had. Her saying that Edison does certain things that it just technologically didn't do, and that's just a plain old lie, and the jury saw that.
Right. Now, but these were not hype or false advertising laws they broke. This is, again, wire fraud. So I guess what is it, false representation made electronically to investors, or what does that mean exactly?
Correct. Well, the wire fraud thing is basically making false claims and letting somebody invest in your company. It involves interstate commerce as well. I do believe that what Theranos was doing when it came to like their Walgreens relationship and what Walgreens was telling their patients. Theranos was responsible for false advertising there. But those weren't kind of like the big sexy claims that prosecutors wanted to go after. If Theranos is telling a pharmaceutical partner that our technology does all these things, first of all, it's incumbent upon Walgreens to make sure that the Theranos tech works as it does.
Right.
If it doesn't, there's a problem.
Right.
So they can't just be relying on what Theranos says. But then for Walgreens to go out and tell patients, yes, with just a drop of blood, you can do all these kinds of tests that it used to take, intravenous blood testing to do. That's a really changing thing in people's lives. They have to kind of know what they're saying.
Did you attend, have you attended any of the trials?
I've not attended in person. I've followed closely every
Mm.
day, and I've commented with reporters who are actually in the building.
It is really, well, I haven't seen the trials. I mean, I read the coverage. I saw the dropout. I saw bad blood in Silicon Valley. I mean, it's really entertaining, especially if you follow the tech field. It's interesting. It's fun. Any other examples you can think of that are in the news relating hype, false advertising? Or
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's there, like, it's all the time. Like, I'm a huge sports fan. You see false advertising all the time.
Yeah.
What fans are promised. Like, if you buy the season tickets, your team is going to do all this. You've got all these great players. And we know that the vast majority of teams in any of the professional sports leagues we follow don't make the playoffs. We even see teams like the New York Nets with all their superstars who only play 12 games together during the regular season. People rely upon these kinds of promises and I know on these advertising that these teams and these leagues do.
Right.
And they're always disappointed.
Great. Well, is there anything else you'd like to add? I mean, I'll put your information in the show notes. But I think we pretty much covered it. Would you agree? Anything else?
No, I think that was great, Bob. You asked excellent questions.
Really appreciate you coming on, and thank you so much. I'll let you know when this is live, and hopefully we can keep in touch.
Sounds good. My pleasure, Bob. Take care.
Be well. Take care. Thanks.
Bye.